In October 1962, whilst the entire world held its breath over the Cuban Missile Crisis and wondered whether Khrushchev would press the button, a different catastrophe was unfolding in a small barbershop on Marchmont Street in Bloomsbury. It was quiet. It was domestic. And for that reason, it was more terrible than anything happening in the Caribbean. The shop sat at number 57, a narrow, unremarkable premises wedged between other narrow, unremarkable premises in one of London's less glamorous corners. The smell inside was the smell of every barbershop in post-war England. Brill cream, cheap soap, the faintly metallic tang of scissors left too long in disinfectant. On the shelf behind the basin, among the bottles of hair tonic and aftershave, stood a bottle that had once contained cough mixture. It no longer contained cough mixture. Someone had filled it with carbon tetrachloride, an industrial solvent, colourless, with a faint odour of chloroform. It was, in sufficient quantity, lethal. On the 14th of October, Charles George Williams, barber, strict Wesleyan Methodist, father of two, drank the contents of that bottle. Within hours he was dead. His body was found among the hair clippings of other men's heads, on the floor of the shop he had run for decades. The coroner would later record a verdict of accidental death, but Scotland Yard did not find it entirely explicable. Detectives came to the door of his son, a man whose voice was recognized by virtually every person in Britain, a comedian whose range of characters and accents was so vast that listeners sometimes forgot there was a single human being behind them all. The detectives were polite, as detectives tend to be when they are most suspicious, and the question they asked was direct. Kenneth Williams, the funniest man in Britain, the voice of 100 radio characters, the star of the carry-on films, stood before those officers, and for perhaps the first time in his adult life, could not produce a single word. The performer with 1,000 voices had been struck mute. The investigation never resulted in charges. The coroner's verdict stood, but the suspicion lingered long enough to leave a mark. Williams was denied a visa to the United States, a direct consequence, as his diaries and biographers later confirmed, of the police interest in the case. Work in America, which might have broadened his career, was quietly closed off to him, not by his own choice, by the shadow of a question that was never fully answered. And what did Kenneth Williams himself believe? His private notebooks, those extraordinary, obsessive, 43 volumes spanning 46 years, offer his own verdict. He believed his father had taken his own life. The circumstances, he wrote, were too incredible for accident. A man does not accidentally pour industrial solvent into a cough mixture bottle. A man does not accidentally drink from a container that smells of chloroform rather than linctus. The notebooks, in the entries following the funeral, do not record triumph or relief. What they record is bewilderment, as though the son, who had spent his entire life resenting the father, now found himself in an empty room with the resentment still intact and nobody left to aim it at. Charles George Williams had been a hard man, a Methodist who saw theatre as sin and his son's effeminacy as shame. The notebooks are full of poison directed at him, decades of it, written in inks of various colours, in handwriting that changed over the years as though multiple people were doing the writing. Yet even poison requires a living target, and now the target was gone. To understand what happened in that barbershop, the bottle on the shelf, the detectives at the door, one must go back 36 years, to a boy who had not yet learned to speak in other people's voices, because he did not yet know that his own voice was unwelcome. He was born on a street whose name he would later take some care to forget. Bingfield Street, King's Cross, on the 22nd of February, 1926. It was not a fashionable address. King's Cross in the 1920s was working-class London at its most unvarnished. Gaslight, coal dust, the perpetual smell of the railway terminus around the corner. His father cut hair. His mother, Louisa Alexandra, known to everyone as Louis, kept house. His elder sister, Pat, completed a family that was, by every outward measure, ordinary. By every inward measure, it was a disaster. The family moved from Bingfield Street to 57 Marchmont Street during Kenneth's childhood, settling above the Barbershop in 1935. It was here, in the flat above the sound of scissors and small talk, that the boy would live for the next 2 decades, under the same roof as a father who could not comprehend him. One can reconstruct, from the diaries' descriptions of Charles, the kind of scene that must have played out dozens of times. The boy in front of the mirror, performing, always performing, even at 5, at 7, at 10, pulling faces, doing voices, becoming someone else. And the father in the doorway, watching. The contempt was real. The prohibition was absolute. Theatre was not a career. It was a disgrace. Against this stood Louis. She was everything Charles was not, warm where he was rigid, encouraging where he was dismissive. Louis took Kenneth to the cinema in secret. She applauded every school performance as though it were the old Vic. She was the only human being in front of whom Kenneth never performed a role, because she was the only one who wanted the boy behind the roles. He telephoned her every single day until the day he died. The war came. The Blitz tore London apart, and children were evacuated in their thousands. Kenneth was sent to Bicester in Oxfordshire, where he was billeted with a local veterinarian. It was here that the first great transformation of his life took place. The boy from working-class King's Cross began to speak differently. Over weeks and months, in the company of a middle-class household with middle-class diction, young Kenneth absorbed received pronunciation, the accent of the BBC, of the educated, of people who had never lived above a barbershop. He did not decide to adopt it. He absorbed it, the way a gifted mimic absorbs everything, through the ears, through some instinct for imitation that was already, at 14, formidable. This was his first role played not on a stage, but in life. His first borrowed voice. His first discovery that you could leave yourself behind simply by changing the way you opened your mouth. He would never give this accent back. At the Bolt Court School of Lithography, Kenneth was ostensibly training in a practical trade. But neither lithography nor any other craft could compete with what happened in the school hall during end-of-term performances. He could make people laugh, not politely, helplessly, and in the moment of their forgetting themselves, he existed. Their laughter was his proof of life. There was something else, a detail that reveals more than it seems. Throughout his life, Kenneth Williams insisted with considerable vehemence that he was Welsh. "I'm Welsh." He would declare to anyone who questioned it. He was not Welsh. He was born in London. He lived and died in London. But his forebears had come from Wales, and this slender thread was enough for him to claim an identity that was not, strictly speaking, his. It was the behavior of a man who wanted to belong somewhere, because he felt that he belonged to no one. He lived above the barbershop on Marchmont Street until 1956, nearly 3 decades under the same roof as the man who thought theatre was a sin, sleeping in a room above the shop where Charles Williams silently cut the hair of strangers. At 18, the army took him. He loathed every minute, except one night on Ceylon, about which he later wrote 3 lines in his notebook and crossed out 2. In 1944, Kenneth Williams was conscripted into the Royal Engineers. He was thin, fastidious, sharp-tongued, and possessed of an accent that now marked him as something other than what he was, a barber's son pretending, with increasing conviction, to be a gentleman. But the army gave him a gift. Combined Services Entertainment, the CSE, was the military's answer to boredom. Troops stationed in distant corners of the fading empire needed distraction, and it came in the form of concert parties. Kenneth, posted to Ceylon and later Singapore, found himself, for the first time, on a stage that wanted him. The heat was stupefying. The mosquitoes were relentless. The audience was 200 sunburnt squaddies who wanted to forget they were 6,000 miles from home. And onto this stage walked a skinny private with a nose like a periscope and a voice that could become, in the space of a single breath, Winston Churchill, Nellie Wallace, a pompous colonel, or something entirely unclassifiable. They roared. In one performance he broke character mid-sketch. The scene called for a soldier following orders. He stopped. He turned to the audience. He drew himself up, flared his nostrils, and declared, "Oh, I can't be doing with all that, yes. I'm not with that lot." The hall collapsed. The sketch was abandoned. Nobody cared. They had witnessed the birth of a style. What Williams had discovered was that his weapon was not the role itself. His weapon was the visible distance between himself and the role. The audience laughed not because the character was funny, but because the performer was so gloriously above the material. This gap between the man and the act would define everything he did for 40 years. And it would destroy him, too, because you cannot maintain a gap between yourself and everything else without eventually falling into it. But there was another discovery on Ceylon, and this one he did not perform for anyone. It happened at night. A Sikh soldier. The details are sparse because Williams made them sparse. In the notebook, 3 words survive, only fumbling. 2 other lines were crossed out so thoroughly that later scholars could not recover them. Britain in the 1940s did not merely disapprove of homosexuality. It imprisoned men for it, sentences of up to 5 years. Oscar Wilde's martyrdom was still within living memory. Alan Turing was still alive, still breaking codes, but the machinery that would destroy him was already in motion. Kenneth Williams absorbed this not as abstract knowledge, but as biological instruction. He formulated a definition of himself that would hold for the rest of his life. Mentally and spiritually homosexual, he wrote. Physically, no. He was granting himself permission to feel, but forbidding himself permission to act. Desire could exist in the mind. The body was prohibited. In effect, he sentenced himself to solitary confinement, and he would serve that sentence without parole for the next 4 decades. In his notebooks, the rare sexual episodes that surfaced at long intervals were assigned a code, traditional matters, or tradiola, as though encrypting them could reduce their power. The decision was not imposed by law or by society. It was imposed by Kenneth Williams upon Kenneth Williams. The warden was himself. He returned to London with a D-mob suit and a conviction that the only safe way to touch another human being was on a stage in character for the duration of a scene and no longer. The London he returned to was rebuilding itself. Repertory theatre companies were scattered across the country like small fires, each burning with the post-war conviction that culture mattered. Kenneth joined this world in 1948, and for a time it seemed as though it might save him. Rep theatre was grueling, a new play every week. You learned your lines on Monday, rehearsed on Tuesday, opened on Wednesday, and by Friday you had forgotten the character's name because next week's script was already in your hand. It suited Williams perfectly. The relentless pace left no time for introspection. The constant rotation of roles meant he never had to settle into any single identity long enough for it to become uncomfortable. But even then, a tension was visible. He was too vivid for small parts. Audiences watched him when they should have been watching the lead. And he was too peculiar for large ones. He was not a leading man. He was not a character actor. He was something for which the British theatre did not yet have a category. Then Orson Welles walked into his life. In 1955, Welles mounted Moby Dick, rehearsed, at the Duke of York's Theatre. The concept was audacious. A Victorian acting company rehearsing a stage adaptation of Melville's novel, with Welles himself as Ahab. The cast played multiple roles, actors playing characters, and this layering of identity was exactly the challenge Williams was born for. Welles recognized the talent instantly. He would later describe Williams as one of the most remarkable performers I've ever directed. This was not idle praise. Welles had directed the Mercury Theatre. He had directed Citizen Kane. But the collaboration ended in fury. Welles rewrote sections without consulting the cast. For Williams, this was an act of war. He had calibrated every pause, every inflection to the original rhythm. To change the text was to pull the ground from beneath his feet. They quarreled. The outcome was definitive. They never worked together again. The serious stage beckoned. In 1962, Williams appeared in Peter Shaffer's The Private Ear at the Globe Theatre. Critics were struck by his dramatic intensity. Here, they said, was genuine talent beyond comedy. The path to classical theatre was open. Williams turned away. One entry in his notebooks offers an explanation so honest it reads like a confession. Serious theatre demands authenticity. It demands that the actor bring something real, something vulnerable, something true. And authenticity was precisely what Kenneth Williams could not afford. To be real was to risk being seen. To be seen was to be known. And to be known was unthinkable. So he built armor instead. The physical trademarks, the nose tilted at a preposterous angle, the nostrils flaring, the neck elongated, the voice swooping from baritone to falsetto. These were not merely comic techniques. They were fortifications. Every exaggerated gesture was a wall. The more extravagantly he performed, the more completely he vanished behind the performance. Orson Welles had called him a genius. The critics had offered him the serious stage. He chose Carry On instead. 26 films over 20 years. And each one another turn of a lock on a door he had closed himself. In 1954, the British Broadcasting Corporation offered Kenneth Williams something that would change his life more thoroughly than any stage role: a microphone. Hancock's Half Hour debuted on BBC Radio that year, starring Tony Hancock as a pompous, deluded resident of railway cuttings, East Cheam. The show needed supporting voices, characters who could populate Hancock's world with snobs, foreigners, busybodies and eccentrics of every conceivable variety. Williams provided them. all of them. He could conjure a supercilious butler in one breath and a wheedling Cockney wide boy in the next. He produced accents that had never existed in any known geography, vocal constructions so bizarre that listeners wrote to the BBC asking what country these people came from. The answer, of course, was that they came from inside Kenneth Williams's head, which was a country unto itself. Hancock noticed. Hancock, who was brilliant and insecure in roughly equal measure, understood that Williams was stealing his show without appearing to try. The relationship was civil but wary. Hancock drank. Williams did not. Hancock raged against his own inadequacy. Williams did the same, but with ink rather than whiskey, filling notebooks with the same self-laceration that Hancock poured into a glass. The partnership ended when Hancock gradually shed his supporting cast, pursuing a purer, lonelier form of comedy. Williams moved on. Hancock did not, but that reckoning lay years in the future. In 1958, Williams made his first Carry-On film. Carry-On Sergeant was never intended to launch a franchise. It was a low-budget comedy about national service, produced by Peter Rogers and directed by Gerald Thomas, made quickly and cheaply with the expectation of a modest profit and a swift forgetting. It was not forgotten. It spawned a series that would run for 20 years and produce over 30 films, and Kenneth Williams would appear in 26 of them, more than any other performer. A record he never wanted and could never escape. He despised the films. His notebooks are unambiguous. Dreary nonsense, he wrote of one. Witless vacuity of another. The scripts were beneath him. The humor was juvenile. He was a man who had worked with Orson Welles, and here he was mugging for the camera whilst Sid James leered at women and the boom operator tried not to laugh. And yet he kept returning. Year after year, from Carry On Sergeant in 58 to Carry On Emmanuel in 78. The notebooks suggest an answer more painful than contempt. The Carry-On set was the one place where his peculiarities were not merely tolerated but required. His campness, his fastidiousness, his air of being above it all, these were his function. He was the posh one, the prissy one, the one who recoiled from surrounding vulgarity. It was a role that required no pretense, because it was barely a role at all. During the filming of Carry On Nurse in 1959, he fell asleep under the studio lights between takes. The director, rather than waking him, produced a handwritten sign reading, "I am asleep," placed it on his chest and photographed him. The picture circulated around the set. When Williams woke and was shown the photograph, he did not rage. He kept it. In a life defined by friction, this small moment of gentleness was allowed to stand. But if the Carry-On set offered belonging, it also contained a figure who represented everything Williams could not be. Sidney James was Kenneth's polar opposite. Where Williams was cerebral, James was physical. Where Williams recoiled from intimacy, James pursued it with cheerful enthusiasm. Where Williams built defenses, James walked into the world with both hands open and laughed about what he found. Williams could not stand him. The notebooks are venomous on the subject, but the hatred reads, at this distance, less like genuine antipathy than like envy turned inside out. Sid James was easy in his body in a way that Kenneth Williams had forbidden himself to be since that night on Ceylon. To sit next to him 12 hours a day was to be reminded of everything you had renounced. Yet the Carry-On films, for all their vulgarity, were not the summit of his art. That summit was reached on radio, in a program that most of the BBC's own censors did not fully understand. Round the Horn premiered on the BBC Light programme in 1965, and it contained, buried within its sketch format like a coded message inside a birthday card, the most subversive act in the history of British broadcasting. Kenneth Williams and Hugh Paddick played Julian and Sandy, two outrageously camp characters who operated from week to week a series of improbable businesses: a law firm, a theatrical agency, a publishing house. They spoke in Polari, a real living argot used by gay men in Britain since the 19th century, a language of survival, of recognition, of signals passed in dangerous places. How bona to vada your dolly old eek meant, roughly, how lovely to see your nice old face. The BBC censors heard gibberish. They heard funny voices. They waved it through. Millions listened. Millions laughed. And most of those millions had no idea what they were actually hearing. Two gay men, played by two gay actors, speaking a gay language on national radio, 2 full years before the Sexual Offences Act of 1967 began the slow, incomplete process of decriminalizing homosexuality. Julian and Sandy existed in the open before the law permitted them to exist at all. Art, as it so often does, arrived before justice. The irony was exquisite and unbearable. Williams performed freedom 5 days a week in a BBC studio. The freedom to be camp, to be flamboyant, to be unapologetically queer, whilst living, in his private hours, inside a cell of his own construction. Julian and Sandy touched, joked, flirted, inhabited their bodies with the ease of men who had nothing to hide. Kenneth Williams went home each evening to a flat where the second cup on the shelf had not been used in years. The Sexual Offences Act received royal assent on the 27th of July, 1967. Williams noted it in his diary. Briefly, the law, he seemed to feel, changed nothing that mattered. His confinement had never been legal. It was built from shame and fear and a conviction held since Ceylon that the body was territory too dangerous to inhabit. No act of Parliament could demolish those walls. They were load-bearing. Was there ever anyone who got past them? There was. An Australian named Paul Florence, and theirs is the quietest love story you will ever hear. They met in 1958, the same year as the first Carrie on film, as though fate were offering two paths simultaneously, one towards public performance, the other towards private truth. Florence was young, attractive, intelligent, and Australian, from far enough away that the usual English rules might not apply. The exact circumstances of their meeting are undocumented, and it would be dishonest to invent them. They met through a shared social circle. That much is known. The rest belongs to them. What followed was the closest thing Kenneth Williams ever experienced to a romantic relationship. 4 years, 1958 to roughly 1961. The diaries record an emotional intensity that appears nowhere else in his writing, a tenderness, a willingness to feel that is startling in a man who had made rigidity his defining characteristic. But what precisely did those 4 years contain? Here biography must yield to honesty about its own limitations. The diaries describe closeness. They do not describe with any clarity whether the relationship was physically consummated. Williams had defined himself as celibate. Was Florence the exception? The notebooks do not say. Biographers have speculated. Friends offered opinions that were careful and contradictory. We do not know, and to pretend otherwise would be to commit precisely the kind of fabrication that Williams, for all his public masks, never permitted in his private pages. What can be said with certainty is this: Paul Florence was the most important romantic presence in Kenneth Williams's life. After Florence, there was no one. Not because Williams was incapable of feeling. The diaries make clear that feeling was precisely what tormented him, but because he had concluded that physical intimacy constituted what he called denial of self. The phrase appears in the notebooks without further elaboration, as though its meaning were self-evident. It was not. It was almost incomprehensible, the idea that giving oneself to another person was not an act of love but of erasure. And yet this was the theorem by which he lived. Florence departed around 1961. He returned to Australia, but the connection did not end. Telephone calls, letters. Across decades and across the world, right up until April 1988. When Williams died, Paul Florence was still there, at the end of a telephone line stretching from Bloomsbury to the far side of the planet, still connected, still in some form that defies easy categorization, present. After Florence, Williams's friends tried to arrange introductions. Other men, suitable companions. He refused with a fury that made clear the offer was not merely unwelcome, but existentially threatening. To suggest that Kenneth Williams might have a love life was to suggest that the structure he had built, the celibacy, the solitude, the notebooks filled with emptiness, might have been unnecessary. And if unnecessary, then merely waste. 40 years of waste. That possibility was more than he could bear. Paul left, but Kenneth did not remain entirely without warmth. Over the following years, he assembled something that resembled a family, unconventional, incomplete, held together not by blood or law but by affection and habit. Tom Wayne was the first pillar. Young, Oxford-educated, later a figure in media, everything Kenneth admired. The adoration was reciprocated in kind though not in form. There was no physical dimension. What existed between them was deeper than friendship, more constant than many marriages, and conducted entirely above the neck. Clive Dennis was the second pillar, and he could not have been more different. A postman, working class. Possessed of none of Wayne's intellectual polish, but endowed with a warmth that Williams, for all his snobbery, recognized and needed. Kenneth loved contrasts. It was the principle on which his entire comic method was built, and the contrast between these two delighted him. The three of them formed a unit. Evenings together, Scrabble, the preferred arena of combat, trips abroad, and a correspondence that amounted, over the years, to more than 150 letters. Louis Williams completed the circle. Kenneth's mother, by now elderly, was a fixture at these gatherings. She came to performances. Wayne and Dennis accompanied her. Kenneth, Tom, Clive, and Louis, a strange, irregular family that met no conventional definition of the term and yet functioned, in its tender way, as the most stable structure Kenneth Williams ever built. A typical diary entry from this period reads with the flatness of a weather report. Played Scrabble with Tom and Clive. Quite enjoyable. Home by 10. Deliberately drained of emotion. But behind each such entry lay an evening during which the telephone rang for reasons other than duty, and the flat contained more than one voice. In the economy of his life, that was an event. There were trips to Tangier. Morocco in the 1960s was a refuge for British men whose desires were illegal at home. Paul Bowles, Joe Orton, Francis Bacon had all sought its freedoms. Kenneth went several times. The diaries record these visits with conspicuous brevity. Silence, as with so much in his life, communicated more than any entry could have. And then Joe Orton arrived, and with Orton came the thing that Kenneth Williams had spent his entire life trying to avoid: uncontrollable, violent, irreversible reality. Joseph Halliwell Orton, Joe, was a playwright, a provocateur, and the most dangerous man Kenneth Williams ever befriended. Where Williams hid behind voices and mannerisms, Orton hid behind nothing. He was openly, flagrantly homosexual in an era when such openness could still result in prosecution. He wrote plays that detonated beneath the polite surface of English theatre like mines buried in a vicarage garden. Entertaining Mr. Sloane. A loot. What the butler saw. He was funny in the way that a blade is funny. The joke arrived at the same moment as the wound. In 1965, Kenneth appeared in the original West End production of Loot, Orton's savage farce about death, corruption, and the Catholic Church, in which a stolen fortune is hidden in a coffin and a dead woman's body is shunted from place to place like an inconvenient parcel. Williams, who understood the mechanics of farce better than almost anyone alive, was magnetic in it. They became friends, close friends, the kind who recognize in each other something the rest of the world has missed. Orton kept his own diaries, published posthumously, like Williams's, and equally revelatory. And in them he recorded conversations with Kenneth that are by turns hilarious, tender, and shockingly frank. Two diarists, two gay men, two parallel chronicles of the same impossible era. Reading them side by side is like listening to a conversation conducted across a wall that neither man could quite see over. But Orton was fearless in ways that Williams could only observe with a mixture of admiration and dread. Orton lived in his body. He pursued sex with an appetite that Williams found fascinating and repellent in equal measure. He broke rules, social, sexual, artistic, with the serene confidence of a man who believed rules existed primarily to be exposed as fraudulent. Kenneth Williams broke rules too, but only on stage and only in code. The difference was the difference between a man who sets fire to a building and a man who draws a picture of a building on fire. Both are concerned with flames. Only one gets burned. In April 1967, the three of them, Williams, Orton, and Orton's partner, Kenneth Halliwell, traveled to Tangier together. Halliwell, once Orton's mentor, now his bitter dependent, had watched the pupil outgrow the teacher with humiliating speed. By 1967, the humiliation had become unbearable. In Tangier, Orton did what Orton always did. He pushed boundaries. On one occasion, he laced Kenneth Williams's food with hashish. Williams did not take drugs. He did not drink to excess. He did not surrender control of his faculties for any reason, because control was the only thing standing between him and whatever lay beneath. To have that control taken, secretly, as a joke, by a man he trusted, was an act of violation. He erupted. The fury was volcanic, and for Williams, uncharacteristic in its rawness. This was not the waspish sarcasm of the notebooks or the performative indignation of a panel show. This was genuine rage, the rage of a man whose single, non-negotiable boundary had been crossed. They quarreled. The walls of whatever Tangier lodging they occupied absorbed the noise, and eventually the fury exhausted itself. They reconciled, but the crack in the friendship remained, hairline thin and permanent. 4 months later, Joe Orton was dead. On the 9th of August, 1967, Kenneth Halliwell took a hammer, and struck Joe Orton 9 times on the head as he lay in bed in their shared flat at 25 Noel Road, Islington. 9 blows. The violence was grotesque, disproportionate, the work of a man who had stored years of humiliation in his body and released them all in a single, annihilating minute. Halliwell then swallowed a fatal dose of Nembutal and lay down beside the man he had murdered. They were discovered the following morning by a chauffeur sent to collect Orton for a meeting about a Beatles film script. The scene inside was so appalling that the first officers to enter had to leave and compose themselves before returning. Kenneth Williams learned of the murders from the newspapers, not from a telephone call, not from a friend at his door with the careful preface that precedes unbearable news, from newsprint, from headlines, the same impersonal medium that reported the weather and the cricket scores. His notebook entry for that day is notable for what it does not contain. The man who wrote obsessively about every meal, every slight, every irritation, this man, confronted with the violent death of one of his closest friends, wrote almost nothing. The scholars who have examined the original volumes report brevity so extreme it reads not as restraint but as collapse. The diary, for once, had nothing to say. In the weeks that followed, Williams withdrew. He turned down engagements. He retreated into routines that grew smaller and more rigid, like a man pacing a cell and discovering that the cell is shrinking. The murder confirmed every theorem he had ever formulated about the danger of closeness. Here was the proof, written in blood on a bedroom wall in Islington. Let people close and they destroy each other. The only safe distance is total distance. The only safe room is an empty room. He sealed that door and never reopened it. Just a Minute began on the 22nd of December, 1968, on BBC Radio 4, and it would outlast Kenneth Williams by decades. The format was disarmingly simple. 4 panelists, given a topic, must speak for 60 seconds without hesitation, repetition, or deviation. If they faltered, the others pounced. It was a parlor game elevated to national institution, and Williams was its undisputed master. 60 seconds, no pauses, no repeated words, no straying from the subject. 4 rules, rigid, arbitrary, merciless. And Kenneth Williams, who had spent his life violating every attempt to contain him within a single identity, submitted to these 4 with something approaching joy. In a game built on constraint, he found liberty. The rules gave him a frame, and within that frame he could be as outrageous and inventive as he wished, because himself, within the architecture of a panel game, was just another performance. The clock ran, the words poured out, the audience laughed, and for 60 seconds at a time he was free. His sparring partner was Nicholas Parsons, the programme's chairman. Their on-air relationship was a masterclass in performed hostility. Williams challenged rulings with baroque indignation, accusing Parsons of incompetence and intellectual inadequacy, all delivered in a voice that rose to frequencies normally associated with steam whistles. Parsons absorbed the abuse with the patience of a man defusing a bomb made entirely of ego. Behind the microphone, the irritation was partly genuine. Parsons was, in Kenneth's estimation, too genial, too accommodating, too relentlessly pleasant. What bothered Williams was not any specific failing, but something more fundamental. Parsons appeared to be happy. Simply, uncomplicated, constitutionally happy. And Kenneth Williams found this quality not charming but offensive, an affront to the natural order, which he understood to be essentially tragic. On one memorable edition, Williams invented an Austrian psychiatrist, a fictional authority to whom he attributed increasingly improbable theories whenever challenged. The character arrived without preparation, fully formed, complete with a Viennese accent and imaginary publications. Parsons was bewildered. The other panelists were helpless. The studio audience was in ruins. Several listeners wrote to the BBC afterwards requesting the doctor's name, unaware that he had been conjured from thin air by a man whose entire life was an exercise in conjuring people from thin air. Television wanted him too. The chat shows of the 70s and 80s, Parkinson, Wogan, Russell Harty, competed for his presence. He arrived with anecdotes preloaded, voices warmed up, timing calibrated to the millisecond. He could hold a sofa for 20 minutes without a dead moment. And not one interviewer in 2 decades asked him a real question. They asked him to perform. He performed. They wanted spectacle. He provided it. The transaction was clean, efficient, and mutually satisfying. The only cost was truth. In 1983, he made Comic Roots for the BBC, a program in which he returned to the places of his childhood. King's Cross, Marchmont Street, Bolt Court. He walked the streets with a camera crew, pointing out landmarks, telling stories, deploying his full arsenal. He was funny. He was charming. But the camera caught moments when the talking stopped and the face changed. Standing outside the barbershop where his father had worked and died, his expression became, for 3 or 4 seconds, that of a man looking not at a building, but at a locked door behind which something terrible had been stored and never retrieved. Then the mask returned, the voice brightened, and the show continued. The contrast between public evenings and private ones was absolute. After a recording, after laughter, applause, handshakes in the green room, Kenneth Williams took a taxi back to his flat at Farley Court, Bloomsbury. 1 room, a radio, books. Spartan was a generous word for it. He would eat a boiled egg, a piece of toast, with the frugality of a barber's son who never quite trusted prosperity to last. Then the notebook. Every evening without exception for 46 years, who he had seen, what they had said, what he thought of them, which was usually unflattering, what his body had done, the pain in his stomach, the cramping, the sleeplessness that turned each night into a corridor with no doors, and then the pills, barbiturates for sleep that would not come naturally, painkillers for a stomach slowly digesting itself. The quantities increased with the grim inevitability of tolerance. What worked last month required more this month, and the line between therapeutic dose and lethal dose grew thinner until it was barely a line at all. One notebook entry from this period captures the strange comedy of his evenings. He described, with acid amusement, tourists queuing outside Madame Tussauds, visible from his window. He called them nits. These people, he observed, stood for hours in the rain to gawp at wax replicas of famous people, never suspecting that directly above their heads sat a man who was actually famous, actually alive, and actually wretched. The irony pleased him. Very little else did. His stomach was destroying him. Gastric ulcers, chronic and worsening. Colitis that turned digestion into ordeal. Doctors recommended surgery. He declined. The reason committed to his diary was this: he did not want anyone to see his body, not a surgeon, not a nurse, no one at all. The body was a territory so deeply associated with shame that even a professional medical gaze was intolerable. He would rather hurt than be seen. And so he hurt. He saved his money. He lived below his means. When he died, his will directed the principal sum to his mother, with personal papers bequeathed to his godson, Robert Chiddell, who would become, in later years, a quiet custodian of private memory. The Notebooks, 43 volumes, 1942 to 1988. The handwriting changed over the decades. In the earliest volumes, it was large and confident, the script of a young man who believed clarity of pen might lead to clarity of thought. By the 70s, smaller, more cramped, the words retreating into themselves. By the 80s, tiny and trembling. The inks were color-coded, black for facts, blue for reflection, red for fury, entries written in a heat that scored the page beneath. Even in private confession, Kenneth Williams was performing, organizing anguish into categories, editing despair. He knew they would be read. He did not destroy them. In a life defined by concealment, this was the single act of exposure, the one door left unlocked. 43 volumes addressed to no one and everyone. A monologue delivered into an empty room in the hope that the room would not always be empty. That someone eventually would enter, would sit down, would read, and would understand. 1987 was the year the machinery of his body began its final rebellion. The ulcer intensified. Sleep became virtually impossible without pharmaceutical help, and the pharmaceutical help was itself becoming the problem, the solution compounding the disease it was meant to treat. He was 61 and looked considerably older. The face that had once been all nose and cheekbones and flashing eyes was gaunt now, drawn in a way that went beyond thinness. The body he had never permitted anyone to touch was consuming itself from within, and the irony would not have been lost on him. He had refused intimacy. His own organs had not received the instruction, but he continued to work. Just a minute still required his presence, and he still provided it, the voices, the challenges, the performances so polished they concealed the fact that the performer was falling apart. Around him, the world he had known was emptying. The generation was dying. Hancock dead since '68, suicide in a Sydney flat, surrounded by empty vodka bottles and a note that read, in part, "Things just went wrong too many times." Orton dead since '67, the hammer, the Nembutal, the locked door in Islington. Sid James dead since '76. Collapsed on stage at the Sunderland Empire during a performance of The Mating Season. Heart attack. The audience laughing as his body fell because they thought it was part of the act. Hattie Jacques, dead since 1980, another heart, another silence. One by one, the people who had populated his professional life departed, and each departure left the landscape bearer quieter, more like the room he had always feared becoming. His mother was aging. Louis, his anchor, his daily telephone call, his proof that at least one person cared whether he woke in the morning, was growing frail. The conversations must have carried, beneath their routine, the knowledge that this too would end, that the telephone would ring and no one would answer. Tom Wayne and Clive Dennis still visited, but less frequently. The Scrabble evenings grew rarer. People have their own lives. The letters continued, but letters are a poor substitute for a voice in the next room. The diary entries from early 1988 grow shorter. The handwriting shrinks further. Where once he had recorded conversations verbatim and assessed acquaintances with surgical precision, he now wrote in fragments. Pain, sleep, pain again. The weather. The weather is always the last refuge of a diarist who has run out of things to say about being alive. April arrived. The final entry in the final notebook is dated the 14th of April, 1988. It consists of 6 words, after 46 years of writing, after 43 volumes. After millions of words recording every meal, every slight, every empty evening. The last thing Kenneth Williams committed to paper was this. Oh, what's the bloody point? Not a farewell, not an explanation, not a message to his mother or to Paul Florence or to Tom Wayne. A question. Perhaps rhetorical, or perhaps the most honest question a man can ask, the one that lies beneath all other questions, the one that 43 volumes had been circling without ever quite arriving at. He put down the pen. He closed the notebook. He did not open another. What happened in the flat at Farley Court during the night of the 14th to the 15th of April is known only to the empty rooms and the bottles on the bedside table. Barbiturates. The same broad class of drug that Kenneth Halliwell had used to end his life after murdering Joe Orton 21 years earlier. Whether Williams noted this symmetry, whether it occurred to him at all, cannot be known. The room kept its secrets. In the morning, on the 15th of April, his mother raised the alarm. Louis Williams, who had telephoned every day, who had attended every performance, who had been the one person from whom Kenneth hid nothing and everything simultaneously, knew that something was wrong. Kenneth Williams was found dead in his bed. He was 62 years old. Nobody had knocked on his door that morning. Nobody was expecting him at work. The telephone rang twice that week. Both times before it had been his mother. Now it rang and nobody answered. The inquest was held on the 17th of June, 1988, at the Westminster Coroner's Court. 2 months had passed since the death. The cherry trees along the embankment had bloomed and faded. London had moved on, as London always does, absorbing its losses into the general noise of traffic and commerce. But in the quiet formality of the coroner's court, the question Kenneth Williams had spent his life avoiding was being asked one final time, in a form he could no longer evade. Dr. John Elliot presided. The evidence was laid out. Barbiturates in the bloodstream, empty containers by the bed, a medical history of chronic pain and escalating dosages, a final diary entry of 6 bleak words. Witnesses were heard. The facts were not in dispute. The interpretation of those facts was. Giles Brandreth, writer, broadcaster, and one of Williams's closest companions in the final years, has been unequivocal. I believe he chose to end it, Brandreth has said, in interviews that carry the quiet authority of a man who was present and paying attention. That last diary entry reads as a farewell. The pain, the isolation, the sense that there was nothing left to stay for, he made a decision and he acted on it. He does not say this with drama. He says it with the measured sadness of someone who saw the decision approaching and could not prevent it. Leslie Phillips, actor, colleague, friend, held the opposite view with equal conviction. Williams, Phillips insisted, was terrified of death. He did not want to die. He wanted to sleep. He wanted the pain to stop. He wanted, for one night, to close his eyes without his stomach waking him at 3 in the morning. The barbiturates were his nightly companions, taken in quantities that had long exceeded medical recommendation, and the line between a dose that brings oblivion and a dose that brings death is, for a man who has been escalating his intake for years, not a line at all. It is a smudge. Paul Richardson, another friend, agreed with Phillips. Kenneth was afraid, Richardson maintained, afraid of the unknown. A man so consumed by the need to control every aspect of his existence would not voluntarily step into the one experience that admits no control whatsoever. The notebooks themselves were evidence. A man who needed to document, to categorize, to pin down. Death cannot be documented by the person experiencing it. Kenneth Williams would not have chosen an event he could not record. Those who believe it was deliberate point to the diary entry, the declining health, the absence of future plans, no engagements booked, no letters anticipating events yet to come. Those who believe it was accidental point to the missing suicide note, the unburned diaries, the farewell he never said to his mother. Neither case is conclusive. Neither can be dismissed. The coroner's verdict was 2 words long, open verdict, not suicide, not accidental death, not misadventure, open. The evidence was insufficient to determine, with the certainty the law requires, whether Kenneth Williams had intended to end his life or had simply taken more than his body could survive. The distinction matters legally. Whether it matters in any other sense is a question the people who knew him have spent 36 years failing to agree upon. And perhaps this is fitting. Perhaps the only appropriate conclusion for Kenneth Williams is no conclusion at all. A man who could never determine whether he was a comic or a tragedian, an asexual or a celibate homosexual, a Welshman or a Londoner, a genius or a hack, this man, in dying, remained what he had been in living, undefined. The ambiguity of the inquest was not a failure. It was the most accurate description of Kenneth Williams that any institution ever produced. The funeral was quiet, not grand, not public, not attended by the vast audience that had laughed at him for 40 years without ever knowing him. A small gathering. Tom Wayne was there. Clive Dennis was there. Louis Williams was there, and her grief was of the kind that does not announce itself, but simply fills a room like a change in air pressure, making it difficult to breathe. There were no great speeches, no theatrical tributes. Kenneth Williams was buried, and London continued, and the tourists continued to queue beneath the window of his empty flat, and the world spun on. 5 years later, in 1993, the notebooks were opened. Russell Davies, a critic and broadcaster, was given access to the diaries and tasked with editing a selection for publication. What he found was not what anyone expected. The public had known Kenneth Williams as a funny man, perhaps the funniest voice on British radio, certainly one of the most distinctive performers in the history of British entertainment. They expected wit. They expected gossip. They expected the sparkling personality that had lit up their radios and television screens for decades. What they got was a scream. The published diaries revealed a man in almost continuous psychological distress. The loneliness was not occasional but structural, built into every day, every evening, every sleepless night. The self-hatred was not a pose, but a condition, chronic and worsening, as relentless as the ulcer consuming his stomach. The contempt he directed at others was, the diaries made clear, merely the overflow of a contempt primarily directed at himself. He had spent 46 years writing, and the central theme was a single, sustained, unanswerable accusation. You are not enough. You have never been enough. You will never be enough. Britain read the diaries and recoiled. We laughed at a man who was in agony. The sentence, or variations of it, appeared in reviews, in letters' pages, in the uncomfortable conversations people had with themselves late at night after putting the book down. The reassessment was immediate, and permanent. Kenneth Williams was no longer simply a comic. He was a tragic figure who happened to be funny, the most dangerous combination a human being can embody, because it means that the very thing bringing you closest to other people is the thing concealing how far away from them you actually are. In 2014, a blue plaque was affixed to the wall of Farley Court, Bloomsbury. Barbara Windsor unveiled it, the last surviving star of the carry-on golden era, the woman who had shared screen space with Williams for 20 years. The plaque reads, Kenneth Williams 1926–1988, actor and entertainer lived here. 6 words, actor and entertainer, factually correct, emotionally barren, nothing about the 43 notebooks, nothing about Julian and Sandy, nothing about the cost. English heritage does not traffic in complexity. It identifies, it locates, it commemorates, it does not explain. And so Kenneth Williams's official memorial, the version sanctioned by institutional authority and fixed to a wall in metal, is a mask. One final mask, bolted into the brickwork of the building where he spent his last years with no one for company but a pen and a bottle of pills. Louis Williams survived her son. The date of her death is not widely published, and biographers have respected the family's privacy. What can be said is that she outlived the person she loved most, the boy from Bingfield Street who had telephoned every day, who had never married, who had filled 43 notebooks with everything he could not say aloud, and who had left her the way Charles had left her 26 years earlier, suddenly, ambiguously, and with a bottle by the bed. Kenneth Williams lived 62 years. In that time, he created a body of work that reshaped British comedy, advanced the visibility of gay lives on national media by at least a decade, produced one of the most remarkable literary diaries of the 20th century, and brought genuine, uncomplicated, helpless pleasure to millions of people who never knew his name was attached to anything other than joy. He never married. He never sustained a romantic partnership beyond those 4 years with Paul Florence. He never lived with another person after leaving Marchmont Street. He never had children. He never permitted his body to be loved or healed. He filled 43 volumes with words because words were the only form of intimacy he trusted, the only way of reaching out that did not require reaching out. Now one must return to where the story began, to a barbershop on Marchmont Street, to a bottle on a shelf, because the symmetry is too precise to be ignored and too terrible to be coincidence. 1962, a barbershop, a bottle that had once held cough mixture refilled with carbon tetrachloride. A man drinks. The coroner records accidental death. The Sun disagrees. Scotland Yard investigates. Nobody is charged. The question remains open. 1988. A bedroom. A bottle, several bottles of barbiturates on the bedside table. A man takes pills, perhaps too many, perhaps deliberately too many. The coroner records an open verdict. Friends disagree with each other. Nobody knows. The question remains open. Father and son. 26 years apart. 2 bottles. 2 verdicts that resolve nothing. 2 deaths that ask questions the living cannot answer. Charles George Williams died in the place where he worked, among the tools of his trade, the scissors and the combs and the hair of strangers. Kenneth Charles Williams died in the place where he lived, among the tools of his trade, the notebooks and the pens and the voices that had no one left to entertain. The father died surrounded by the smell of Brill cream and cheap soap. The son died, surrounded by silence. Both men chose containers that concealed their true contents: a cough mixture bottle filled with poison, a medicinal regime filled with enough chemistry to stop a heart. Whether either man intended the final swallow to be the final swallow is unknown. The coroners could not determine it. The detectives could not determine it. The son could not determine it about the father, and we cannot determine it about the son. What we can say, what the record permits us to say, is that Kenneth Williams spent 26 years living with the question of his father's death and never arrived at an answer, and that we have now spent 36 years living with the question of Kenneth's death and have fared no better. The Williams family bequeathed to posterity not answers but questions, two of them identical in shape, separated by a generation, each one sealed inside a bottle that cannot be reopened. There is a photograph. It was taken in the early 1980s, during the Comic Roots filming. Kenneth Williams stands on Marchmont Street, outside the Barbershop. He is smiling because the camera is on, and Kenneth Williams always smiled when the camera was on. Behind him, the shop window reflects the street, the ordinary, unremarkable street where he grew up, where his father cut hair, where a bottle sat on a shelf and waited. He is performing, of course. He is always performing. The smile is a professional instrument, deployed with the same precision as his voices and his nostrils and his immaculate comic timing. But look closely, and the footage exists, for anyone who cares to look, and you will see in the eyes above the smile something that is not a performance, something unguarded, something that lasts for perhaps 3 seconds before the mask returns. What is it? Grief, recognition. The particular sadness of a man standing in the exact spot where his life went wrong and knowing, with absolute clarity, that he cannot go back and make it right. The camera does not say. Kenneth Williams does not say. The notebooks do not say. The coroner does not say. Nobody says. And that silence, the silence of a man who had 1,000 voices and could not use any of them to speak the truth, is the loudest sound in this entire story. He was born above a barbershop and died in a bedsit. Between those 2 rooms, he made a nation laugh. The laughter is preserved, on tape, on film, in the memory of everyone who ever heard that extraordinary voice swoop and soar and crack with indignation. The pain is preserved too in 43 notebooks, in ink that has not faded, in handwriting that grew smaller year by year until it almost disappeared. Both are true. Both existed simultaneously in the same man for 62 years. The laughter and the pain, the 1,000 voices and the silence. The masks and the face behind the masks, which nobody, not his mother, not Paul Florence, not Tom Wayne, not Clive Dennis, not the millions who adored him ever fully saw. 2 bottles, 2 verdicts, 2 rooms, 1 life. And a question written in a shaking hand on the 14th of April, 1988, that nobody has yet been able to answer. Oh, what's the bloody point? Perhaps the point was this, that a man who could not love himself taught a nation to love laughter, that a man imprisoned by shame smuggled freedom onto the airwaves in a language the censors could not decode, that a man who trusted no one with his body trusted everyone with his voice, and that voice, even now, even after the silence, is still speaking. Listen carefully. You can hear it still. There is a recording. It exists in the BBC archives, catalogued and preserved with the institutional care that the corporation extends to things it considers nationally significant. It is a recording of just a minute, date uncertain. One of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of such recordings, made over 20 years in studios that smelled of coffee and carpet and the faint, permanent anxiety of live performance. In this particular recording, Kenneth Williams is given the subject, happiness. 60 seconds, no hesitation, no repetition, no deviation. He begins, and the voice, that impossible, unmistakable voice, rises from the speakers like something released from a cage. He does not talk about happiness. He talks around it, above it, beneath it. He describes what happiness is not. He catalogues its failures. He mocks its pretensions. He dismantles it with the surgical glee of a man performing an autopsy on a butterfly. And the audience laughs, great, helpless waves of laughter that crash against the studio walls and subside only to rise again, because Kenneth Williams talking about happiness is, by its very nature, the funniest thing they have ever heard. He does not use the word lonely. He does not use the word afraid. He does not use any word that might, even accidentally, reveal the man behind the microphone. And yet, if you listen, truly listen, past the voices and the timing and the audience's delight, you can hear it. A hairline fracture running through every syllable. The sound of a man who knows exactly what happiness is because he has spent his entire life in its absence. The buzzer sounds. 60 seconds. He has won the round. The audience applauds. Nicholas Parsons moves to the next subject, and the moment passes as all moments pass into the archive and the silence. But the recording remains. And that, perhaps, is the answer to the question he asked on the 14th of April. The bloody point. There is a bench in Bloomsbury, not a memorial bench, not an official tribute, just a bench on a street near Farley Court where an old man with a sharp nose might have sat on a spring afternoon, watching the world go about its business with an expression of magnificent disapproval. No plaque marks it. No flowers are left upon it. It is simply a bench, and the fact that Kenneth Williams may or may not have sat on it is of no historical consequence whatsoever. But permit the image for a moment. A man on a bench, alone because he was always alone, watching tourists queue for Madame Tussauds, thinking thoughts that he would later commit to a notebook in 3 colors of ink. Alive, for the moment, in a body he did not want and a world he could not leave. The world has changed since he left it. The Sexual Offences Act of 1967, which he noted in his diary with such conspicuous brevity, was followed by decades of incremental progress, each step contested, each victory incomplete, but each one moving in a direction that would have been unimaginable to the boy who crossed out 2 lines in a notebook on Ceylon. Civil partnerships in 2004. Marriage equality in 2014. The word gay spoken on the BBC without apology, without code, without Polari. Julian and Sandy would not need Polari now. They could speak plainly. They could say what they meant. They could walk down a London street holding hands, and the worst they would face, on most days, in most places, is indifference. The world Kenneth Williams feared has not vanished, but it has contracted. The prison is smaller. The walls are lower. The door is, for many, open. Would he have walked through it? The question is unanswerable, and asking it risks a sentimentality that Williams himself would have found repulsive. He was not a symbol. He was not a cautionary tale. He was not the tragic gay martyr of post-war British entertainment, however neatly he might fit that narrative. He was a man, specific, contradictory, infuriating, brilliant, who made choices that were his own, for reasons that were his own, and who left behind a body of work, and a body of writing that do not require our pity. They require our attention. Listen to Julian and Sandy. Do not listen with modern ears tuned to identify oppression. Listen with the ears of 1966. Listen as a gay man in Wolverhampton or Plymouth or Dundee would have listened, sitting by his radio in a rented room, alone, perhaps afraid, certainly invisible. And then hear Julian's voice, Kenneth's voice, burst through the speaker. "Oh, hello, I'm Julian and this is my friend Sandy." Hear the joy in it, the defiance, the sheer, reckless, glorious camp of it, and understand what that voice meant to the man in the rented room. It meant, you are not alone. There are others. We exist. We are here on the BBC, in your living room, in broad daylight, and we are not ashamed. Kenneth Williams could not say that to himself, but he said it to a nation, and the nation heard, even if it did not fully understand what it was hearing. There is a boy standing in front of a mirror in a flat above a barbershop on Marchmont Street. He is perhaps 7 years old. He is pulling faces. He is doing voices. He is discovering for the first time that he can become someone else, and that the someone else is more welcome in the world than he is. In the doorway stands his father, watching, with an expression that the boy will spend the rest of his life trying to decode. Is it contempt? Disgust? Or is it something more complicated? The bewildered, inarticulate recognition of a man who sees in his son something he cannot name and therefore cannot accept. The boy does not stop performing. He will never stop. He will perform in concert halls on Ceylon. He will perform for Orson Welles. He will perform in 26 carry-on films, on 1,000 editions of Just a Minute, on every chat show sofa in Britain. He will perform in 43 notebooks, for an audience of one, in a flat where the only applause is the scratch of pen on paper. He will perform until the pen stops moving, and then, at last, there will be silence. But before the silence, before the bottle and the verdict and the question that has no answer, there is this: a boy in front of a mirror becoming someone else, and in the becoming setting something free. Not himself, never himself, but something that lived inside him and needed to get out, some vast, ungovernable, incandescent talent that could not be contained by shame or fear or loneliness, or the disapproval of a Methodist barber from King's Cross. That talent is what remains, not the pain, not the pills, not the empty flat or the open verdict or the blue plaque that says nothing worth saying. What remains is the voice, the voices. 1,000 of them, each one invented, each one inhabited with a precision and a joy that no amount of private suffering could diminish. Kenneth Williams gave those voices to the world. He kept the silence for himself. It was an unequal exchange, and he knew it, and he made it anyway every day for 40 years, because that was the bargain he had struck with his talent, with his fear, with whatever God or accident had placed him in a body he could not love and a world he could not leave. The bargain was cruel. The art was not. Listen to the recordings. Read the diaries. Stand outside the barbershop on Marchmont Street, if it is still there, and look up at the windows above. Think of the boy. Think of the man. Think of the distance between them, a distance that should have been a life but became, instead, a performance. And then, because he would have wanted this, because laughter was the only currency he trusted, because even now, even from this distance, the voice retains its power to ambush you with delight, then allow yourself to laugh. He earned that much. He earned it every day of his life, in every voice he ever invented, in every flared nostril and elongated neck, and swooping, preposterous, magnificent vocal flight. He earned it in the concert parties on Ceylon and the carry-on sets at Pinewood and the BBC studios on Portland Place. He earned it alone, in a flat in Bloomsbury, writing notebooks that nobody would read for 15 years. He earned it in code, in Polari, in a language designed to be understood only by people who needed it most. He earned the laughter. What he could not earn, what none of us can earn, because it is not a transaction but a gift, was the peace that should have followed it. The laughter remains. The peace never came. And between those two facts lies the whole of Kenneth Williams, the funniest, loneliest, most brilliantly defended man in the history of British entertainment. 1,000 voices, 43 notebooks, 26 films, 20 years of 60-second rounds, one flat, one bed, one bottle. And a question, still waiting for an answer, in a notebook that is now kept in the British Library, catalogued and preserved and available for consultation by anyone who cares to look. Oh, what's the bloody point? The point, Kenneth, was you.